At 8,300 meters on Mount Everest, the human body is no longer designed to function. Oxygen pressure is reduced to roughly 30% of sea level conditions. Even with bottled oxygen, the brain operates at a deficit. Judgment slows. Motor control weakens. Errors become difficult to recognize while they are happening. The two women were already above that line. They had been moving upward for hours in darkness, following a fixed rope that disappeared into cloud. Their headlamps illuminated only a narrow cone of snow and ice. Wind speed had increased steadily since midnight. Temperatures were falling below -30 degrees Celsius. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Their Sherpas were watching the same indicators they always watched. Step count per minute. Breathing rhythm. Oxygen flow rates. Time elapsed since leaving the South Kernel. None of the numbers were favorable. The climb was behind schedule. Oxygen consumption was higher than planned. Their pace was slower than the minimum required for a safe descent before daylight. Each delay increased the probability of running out of oxygen before reaching lower camps. These conditions were not unexpected. The forecast had warned of a short weather window. The risks of late summit pushes on this route were well documented. The altitude effects were universal and well understood. By the time they reached this height, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Survival depended on margins that had already been spent. Turning back would not restore lost time or lost strength. Continuing upward would further reduce the chances of returning alive. The Sherpas understood this. They had seen similar timelines before. They had learned to recognize the point where options disappear. That point had already passed. The expedition took place on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest during the spring climbing season, in the second half of May. This period is considered the most stable window of the year, positioned between the winter jet stream and the arrival of the summer monsoon. Even in this window, conditions remain hostile and unpredictable. The route begins at base camp at 5,364 meters and ascends through a series of fixed camps. Camp 2 sits at approximately 6,400 meters, Camp 3 at 7,200 meters, and the South Col at 7,950 meters. Above the South Col lies the death zone, defined as any altitude above 8,000 meters, where atmospheric pressure drops below 356 millibars. At these pressures, oxygen availability is insufficient to sustain human life for extended periods. Even with supplemental oxygen flowing at 3 to 4 liters per minute, climbers experience progressive hypoxia. Heart rate increases. Fine motor control deteriorates. Decision-making becomes unreliable. Weather data for the summit zone on the day of the climb showed sustained winds of 40 to 50 km per hour at 8,500 meters, with gusts exceeding 70. Ambient temperatures ranged from -28 to -35 degrees Celsius. Wind chill reduced effective temperatures to below -50. The margin for safe movement under these conditions is measured in hours, not days. Most successful summit attempts aim to reach the top before 12 o'clock local time. After that, descending climbers face falling temperatures, rising winds, and rapidly declining physical reserves. On this expedition, delays earlier on the route had already compressed that margin. The summit push began later than planned. Oxygen reserves were calculated for ideal conditions, not for prolonged exposure or reduced pace. Before the climb had truly begun, the safety buffer was already nearly gone. The two climbers were both women in their early 40s. Neither was new to endurance challenges, but their experience at extreme altitude differed significantly from the demands of an 8,000-meter peak. The first climber was a senior corporate professional from North America. She had a background in long-distance running and had completed multiple high-altitude treks in the Andes and Himalaya, reaching elevations between 5,500 and 6,500 meters. Her motivation was personal achievement rather than technical alpinism. Everest represented a symbolic summit, the culmination of years of preparation, fundraising, and public commitment. Her experience above 7,000 meters was limited to a single rotation on a previous expedition that ended early due to weather. The second climber was a European national with amateur mountaineering experience. She had summited several peaks in the 6,000-meter range and one 7,000-meter mountain with supplemental oxygen. She had no prior exposure to the death zone. Her motivation was incremental progression. Everest was viewed as the next logical step, undertaken through a commercial expedition that reduced logistical complexity but not physiological risk. Neither woman had demonstrated repeated performance above 7,500 meters. Both relied heavily on guided structure, fixed ropes, and bottled oxygen to compensate for limited exposure to extreme altitude. Supporting them were 3 Sherpas assigned to the summit push. All 3 were highly experienced high-altitude workers from the Khumbu region. Each had summited Mount Everest multiple times, some more than 10. They were responsible for route fixing, oxygen management, pacing, and emergency decision-making. Their role, however, existed under constraints. As contracted guides, they were financially dependent on successful summits. Turning clients around early often resulted in dissatisfaction, reputational damage, or loss of future work. At the same time, they carried moral responsibility for lives placed in their care. This created a persistent gray zone. The Sherpas were not free agents making purely technical decisions. The climbers were not passive participants without agency. Each relied on the other to validate choices as conditions deteriorated. No one involved was reckless. No one intended harm. Every person on the rope believed at each stage that continuing was still possible. That belief would narrow gradually, until it could no longer be sustained. The first warning signs appeared days before the summit attempt, during the final acclimatization rotation above Camp 3. Both climbers showed slower than expected recovery times after sleeping at 7,200 meters. Morning oxygen saturation readings taken with pulse oximeters measured in the low 70% range, compared to the mid-80s typically observed in well-acclimatized climbers at that altitude while on supplemental oxygen. Neither reading triggered an automatic stop, but both indicated marginal adaptation. During the descent back to Camp 2, one climber reported persistent headaches and nausea lasting more than 12 hours. The symptoms were consistent with moderate acute mountain sickness. Standard protocol recommends rest or descent if symptoms persist beyond a single sleep cycle. Instead, symptoms were treated with acetazolamide and supplemental oxygen, masking the underlying issue without resolving it. Equipment concerns emerged at the same time. Oxygen regulators assigned to the team were older models with manual flow control. Flow rates were set conservatively at 2.5 to 3 liters per minute to preserve cylinder supply. At rest, this was marginally adequate. Under exertion, it was not. One climber also reported intermittent freezing in her mask valve during night use. Ice buildup reduced airflow and required manual clearing. This was documented by a Sherpa and reported to the expedition leader. No replacement mask was issued before summit night. Acclimatization schedules had also been compressed. Due to congestion in the Khumbu icefall earlier in the season, the team skipped a planned rest day at Camp 2. The ascent rate from 6,400 to 7,950 meters occurred over fewer nights than recommended. This increased cumulative fatigue and reduced physiological adaptation. Clear verbal warnings were given. One Sherpa advised delaying the summit push by at least 24 hours to allow additional rest and to monitor weather updates. Another expressed concern about oxygen reserves if pace did not improve above the south kernel. These warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. The forecast showed a short weather window. Other teams were preparing to move. Waiting risked missing the opportunity entirely. The decision to proceed was not made under panic. It was made under pressure created by time, cost, and expectation. The red flags were visible. They were recorded. They were discussed. They were also rationalized as manageable. The summit push began from the south col at approximately 21:30 local time. The planned departure had been 2000 hours. The delay was attributed to congestion at Camp 3 earlier in the evening and extended time required to fit oxygen masks and check regulators. At departure, wind speeds measured an estimated 35 kilometers per hour. Temperature was approximately minus 28 degrees Celsius. Within the first hour, the first warning emerged. The team's pace was slower than projected. The lead Sherpa calculated an average ascent rate of fewer than 120 vertical meters per hour. For a safe summit and descent, the minimum target was closer to 180. He communicated this quietly and suggested increasing oxygen flow to compensate. The flow rate was raised from 2.5 to 3 liters per minute. They continued upward. By 22:45, at approximately 8,150 meters, the second warning appeared. One climber stopped repeatedly to adjust her mask. Ice had begun forming around the exhaust valve, reducing airflow. Her breathing rate increased. The Sherpa recommended stopping to clear the valve fully and reassess oxygen usage. The pause lasted 6 minutes. Wind speed increased. Body temperature dropped. They continued upward. At 23:30, oxygen consumption was recalculated. Increased flow rates meant cylinders would empty earlier than planned. The Sherpas noted that turnaround time would need to be strictly enforced. The agreed limit was 1 o'clock. Past that point, descent before daylight would be unlikely. The climbers acknowledged the limit. They continued upward. At midnight, the team reached approximately 8,300 meters. This marked the entry into sustained death zone exposure. One climber's coordination visibly declined. She struggled to clip and unclip from the fixed rope. Her steps became irregular. A Sherpa advised turning back immediately, citing deteriorating motor control and delayed response to verbal cues. The advice was discussed briefly. The climber insisted she could continue if pace remained slow and steady. Oxygen flow was increased again, now approaching 4 liters per minute. They continued upward. By 0:45, wind gusts intensified beyond forecast. Estimates exceeded 60 kilometers per hour. Wind chill pushed effective temperature below -50 Celsius. The second climber reported numbness in her hands despite insulated gloves. Fine motor function decreased. Adjusting carabiners took significantly longer. Another warning was issued. The Sherpa pointed out that the time limit had passed. Turning around now would still require descending in darkness but with remaining oxygen reserves. Continuing higher would push descent into daylight with uncertain weather. They continued upward. At 1:30, oxygen gauges showed remaining supply at less than 40%. At the current flow rate, this allowed approximately 1.5 hours of use. The summit was still several hundred vertical meters away. The team's ascent rate had slowed further to under 100 meters per hour. The Sherpas warned that even a successful summit would leave insufficient oxygen for descent to the south kernel. The risk was stated clearly. No one argued with the numbers. The response was silence followed by continued movement. They continued upward. At 2:15, the first climber stumbled and fell onto the rope. She did not lose consciousness but required assistance to stand. Her speech became slurred. Cognitive delay was apparent. The Sherpa nearest to her attempted to reduce pace further and suggested immediate descent. The climber nodded but continued climbing once upright. They continued upward. By 3 o'clock, cloud cover thickened. Visibility dropped to less than 20 meters. Wind noise masked verbal communication. Hand signals were used but often misunderstood. The team became stretched out along the rope, increasing response time to any incident. Oxygen levels dropped below 25%. One regulator began delivering inconsistent flow due to ice buildup. Breathing resistance increased. The Sherpa attempted to clear the system while clipped to the rope, losing more time. They continued upward. At 3:45, the final warning was given. The lead Sherpa stated that survival margins were gone. He indicated that descent was now as dangerous as ascent, but ascent offered no improvement in conditions. The decision window had closed. No one turned around. They continued upward, moving deeper into a situation where each step reduced the remaining options. The escalation was complete. At approximately 8,400 meters, the team entered the upper section of the death zone where physiological decline accelerates rapidly regardless of fitness or experience. Atmospheric pressure at this altitude is near 333 millibars, less than 1/3 of sea level conditions. Even with supplemental oxygen flowing at 4 liters per minute, the effective oxygen delivery to the brain remains critically low. At this point, oxygen math became unavoidable. Each cylinder carried roughly 3 to 4 hours of supply at moderate flow rates. With flow already increased to compensate for exhaustion and cold, remaining usable time dropped to under 2 hours. Descent from this altitude to the South Col typically requires 4 to 6 hours under ideal conditions. Those conditions no longer existed. Time pressure compounded the problem. It was now past 4 o'clock local time. Sunrise was approaching, but daylight would not bring warmth. Instead, wind speeds continued to rise as the jet stream shifted south. Forecasts had predicted this change, but its arrival was earlier than expected. Gusts exceeded 70 kilometers per hour, forcing climbers to brace themselves against the rope to remain upright. Turning back at this stage no longer restored safety. Descending required the same motor coordination, oxygen supply, and cognitive clarity that were already failing. Stopping to change cylinders or adjust equipment risked rapid cooling and loss of dexterity. Prolonged pauses increased the likelihood of frostbite and hypothermia. The fixed rope ahead led upward into worse exposure. The rope behind led downward into darkness, wind, and exhaustion. There was no route that reduced risk. There was only direction. The Sherpas understood that the margin for survival had reached zero. From this point forward, every action consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. The situation had transitioned from hazardous to unrecoverable. The climb continued not because it was safe, but because there was no longer a safe alternative. Mechanical reliability decreases sharply above 8,000 meters. Cold temperatures thicken lubricants, harden plastics, and promote ice formation in any system that moves air or moisture. Oxygen delivery equipment is especially vulnerable. Regulators rely on precise tolerances. Masks depend on flexible seals. Both fail predictably in extreme cold. At approximately 8,500 meters on Mount Everest, the first oxygen system failure became apparent. One regulator delivered intermittent flow despite being set at a constant rate. Ice crystals had formed inside the demand valve, reducing throughput. Each inhalation required greater effort. The climber responded by breathing faster, which increased oxygen consumption without improving oxygenation. Mask performance degraded next. Condensation from exhaled breath froze along the exhaust ports. This increased back pressure and reduced effective airflow. Clearing the ice required removing gloves, exposing skin to temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. Dexterity was already compromised. Clearing attempts were incomplete. At this altitude, the human body deteriorates even without equipment failure. Blood oxygen saturation falls below 60%. Cognitive processing slows measurably. Reaction time increases. Simple arithmetic becomes difficult. Judgment narrows to immediate physical tasks. Peripheral vasoconstriction intensifies to preserve core temperature. Fingers and toes lose circulation. Fine motor skills disappear. Tasks such as clipping carabiners, adjusting straps, or operating valves require assistance or multiple attempts. Each delay increases cold exposure. Respiratory muscles fatigue rapidly due to hypoxia. Breathing becomes shallow and inefficient. Carbon dioxide clearance decreases, further impairing cognition. Speech becomes slurred. Visual narrowing occurs. These failures were not sudden. They followed known patterns documented in high-altitude medicine and expedition reports. Equipment malfunction accelerated physical decline. Physical decline made equipment management harder. Each reinforced the other. By the time both systems were failing simultaneously, recovery was no longer possible. The combined effects of cold, hypoxia, and mechanical degradation had exceeded the limits of human compensation. As the team continued upward, other climbers on the southeast ridge began to observe the situation from below. Several commercial expeditions had turned back earlier than planned after encountering increasing winds and deteriorating visibility. Headlamp clusters that normally moved steadily upward were now reversing direction. At approximately 3:30, radio traffic increased across the route. A guide descending from above 8,600 meters reported sustained winds strong enough to knock climbers off balance. He warned that progress above that point had slowed to near zero and that multiple climbers were already showing signs of severe exhaustion. His message was broadcast on a shared channel monitored by several teams, including the Sherpas below. Another team at the balcony reported oxygen shortages among their members due to increased flow rates caused by cold and exertion. They confirmed that regulators were freezing intermittently and that mask icing was widespread. The report included a direct recommendation to abandon summit attempts immediately. These warnings were relayed downward through Sherpa networks. One Sherpa on the route attempted to signal the ascending group using hand gestures and shouted instructions as they passed within visual range. Communication was limited by wind noise and distance. The message was understood only partially. At 4:15, a radio transmission from a climber already descending confirmed that visibility above the balcony had dropped below 10 meters. Fixed ropes were difficult to locate. He stated that conditions were the worst he had experienced during any spring ascent. By the time these external confirmations accumulated, the ascending team was already too high and too depleted to respond effectively. The information did not introduce new risks. It validated the risks that had already been identified hours earlier. The warnings arrived intact. The timing rendered them ineffective. At approximately 4:50 local time, at an estimated altitude of 8,550 meters, the first climber stopped moving. She was clipped to the fixed rope and standing upright but did not respond to verbal prompts. Oxygen flow was still active, though reduced by ice obstruction. Her head was tilted forward. Breathing was shallow and irregular. A Sherpa attempted to adjust her regulator. The climber did not assist. When instructed to step downward, she did not initiate movement. After approximately 2 minutes, her knees buckled and she was lowered into a seated position against the slope. At 5:05, the second climber reached the same position. Her pace had slowed to fewer than 10 steps per minute. She removed one glove briefly to adjust her mask and was unable to reseal it fully. Oxygen flow dropped further. She sat down voluntarily and did not stand again. At 5:20, both climbers were stationary. Oxygen gauges indicated near-empty cylinders. No spare cylinders were available at that altitude. Attempts to encourage descent were unsuccessful. Verbal responses were delayed or absent. By 5:40, breathing in the first climber had become sporadic. Chest movement was shallow and infrequent. Pulse was not assessed due to glove removal risk. The second climber leaned forward and remained motionless. At 6 o'clock, sunrise occurred. Light levels increased but temperature did not. Wind remained strong. No change in responsiveness was observed. At approximately 6:20, visible breathing ceased in the first climber. The second climber showed no detectable movement shortly thereafter. No resuscitation was attempted. At this altitude, intervention was not possible. The Sherpas secured the area briefly and then began their own descent while oxygen remained. The bodies were left in place, clipped to the rope at the altitude where movement stopped. The surviving Sherpas descended to the South Col later that morning with symptoms of severe exhaustion, frostbite to fingers and toes, and acute hypoxia. One required supplemental oxygen for more than 24 hours after descent. None required evacuation by helicopter, as weather conditions prevented flight operations above Camp 2 for 2 days. The bodies of the two climbers remained on the upper southeast ridge. Recovery was deemed unsafe due to altitude, exposure and resource constraints. Their locations were documented by GPS and visual confirmation from descending teams. An internal investigation by the expedition operator and a subsequent review by local authorities identified multiple decision points where the ascent should have ended. These included delayed departure from the South Col, failure to enforce the predetermined turnaround time, continued ascent despite declining motor coordination, and increased oxygen consumption that exceeded descent requirements. Weather data confirmed that the forecast deterioration occurred within expected parameters. Equipment inspection of remaining oxygen systems showed ice-related flow restriction consistent with reported failures. No single action was identified as the sole cause. The deaths were attributed to cumulative risk escalation, delayed retreat and prolonged exposure above 8,400 meters. The findings concluded that survival became impossible hours before the final collapse. No further action was taken.